Sorry if I kept you waiting. I was just walking the grounds outside, like I used to do every morning, studying my surroundings, sizing up the situation. You see, that's my job. In 1960, I was one of 4 federal marshals that escorted Miss Ruby Bridges to this classroom here at William Frantz Elementary. This was a big deal because Ruby was one of the first African-American children to attend an all-white school here in New Orleans. Every day, the city streets would be lined with angry protesters, shouting, hoping for a chance to do something violent. See this armband? This armband told those protesters that I was a federal marshal. Any idea what a federal marshal is? What do you think? Any guesses? Law enforcement officer. In this case, a federal marshal is a police officer that works directly for the federal government, specifically the courts. And this armband told those protesters that if they messed with me, they messed with the entire federal government. Why do you think that was important? Well, what do you think? What's more intimidating? Going up against one man or the entire government? I mean, don't I look pretty intimidating? How about now? Why do you think I sometimes wore sunglasses while I worked? To be more intimidating. Not a bad idea. The truth is, I wore these sunglasses so that people couldn't tell that I was scared. You see, in tense situations, a federal marshal is trained to never show emotion, not even a smile. The wrong person might get the wrong idea and think that I was weak and try to do something really dumb. But that's not what we're here to talk about. I've got something here I'd like to show you. This is a painting by the famous artist Norman Rockwell, and it hangs in the offices of most federal marshals to this day. This right here is Miss Ruby Bridges. And this right here is me. My wife always says it's her favorite picture of me ever because you can't see my face. I like it because I think it must show the world the way that Ruby saw it. Just look how brave and determined she seems. She was something else. You know, this classroom is something else too. It looks almost exactly like it did in 1960, but there's something different. I can't quite put my finger on it. I've got it. We can't hear the protesters outside. Every day, Ruby could hear all those people shouting and calling her bad names. Do you think you could concentrate on your schoolwork hearing people shout nasty things about you? It's pretty tough on Ruby, too. And the reason this whole thing happened was because in 1954, the government put an end to separate but equal education. Does anybody know what separate but equal meant? They had to be educated, but they had to be separated. That's not a bad answer at all. Separate but equal meant that black and white school children could attend separate classrooms so long as the education they received was the same. But take a look at these pictures of a white classroom and a black classroom from a similar time period. Do they look the same to you? What are some of the differences that you notice? The white classroom has desks. Yeah. Anything else? Are they sharing books? You know, it looks like they might be. It's kind of hard to tell, but it looks like it's possible. I'll tell you what else I see. I noticed that there's a lot of artwork and teaching aids hung on the walls in the white classroom. There's 3 little posters here, but that's about it. I see that the white classroom has nice finished walls and blackboards. This is made with rough-hewn wood, both on the floor and the ceiling and the walls. I see this big pot-bellied stove here in the middle of the black classroom, which even by this time period was pretty outdated technology. Well, you know, it didn't look very equal to the Supreme Court either. And their decision meant that white and black students had the right to attend the same schools. But down here in New Orleans, it looked to the people down here that the federal government way up in Washington, D.C., was trying to impose its will on the country where it wasn't wanted. And I mean the entire country. Segregation, the separation of people by the color of their skin, it didn't just happen in the South, you know. Sometimes when things like this change, it makes people scared. You see, some white people thought they were better than black people simply because they were white. And they believed it because their parents believed it, and their parents believed it before them, going back for hundreds of years. For some, segregation wasn't only natural, but it was the way God wanted things to be. How else can you explain this? This is one of the crowds that waited for Ruby outside of the classroom. And this right here is a little girl proudly holding up a cross. Now, no matter what your religious feelings happen to be, we can all mostly agree that a cross is usually a symbol of peace. But in this case, that cross stands for hatred. Now, the people in this picture are just regular, ordinary people, people like you might see anywhere. But look closely. This right here is a black baby doll inside of a coffin. You know something must be terribly wrong when adults would try to frighten a young girl with an image of her own death. Can I be honest with you? At the time, I had my doubts too. Now, as a federal marshal, I would always follow orders. I would always do what I was told. But inside, I wondered, does the federal government have the right to tell people how to live their lives? If this is a free country, then aren't we free to make our own mistakes? My attitude changed the first time that Mrs. Henry, Ruby's mother, stayed home. That day, it was just me, Ruby, and the other federal marshals marching through an army of jeering protesters. That was one of the scariest moments of my life. But being a professional, I just said to myself, concentrate, concentrate. Just keep walking through the crowd. And then it hit me. If I was scared, Ruby must be frightened to death. So I looked over at her, and she had her hands down by her sides, and she was mumbling something to herself. Poor thing, I thought, she's cracking up. So I leaned in closer, and do you know what she was doing? Praying. Yes, praying, and not for herself. She was praying to God to forgive those angry protesters shouting at her. Now, you remember that I said a federal marshal is not supposed to show emotion. That was the most emotional moment of my life. And I had to just keep on walking as if nothing had happened. Those people in that crowd showed humanity at its worst, while Ruby just walked on with the courage and determination of people at their best. And at that moment, I realized the Bridges weren't trying to ruin anybody else's lives. They were just trying to make their own lives as good as anybody else's. And from that moment on, I was 100% on Ruby's side. and there weren't a lot of people on Ruby's side at the time. Luckily, her teacher, Mrs. Henry, was on Ruby's side. And let me tell you why I admired Mrs. Henry so much. She didn't do most of her teaching from up in the front of the room, no. She sat right next to Ruby and taught her side by side. Do you know the reason she did this? Any ideas? They were the only ones in the room. The white families had pulled their students out of school rather than have them be taught in the same school with Ruby. Now, you can say anything you want about equal opportunity or quality education, but if Mrs. Henry had done all of her teaching from the front of the room, all of her work would have just been a lot of pretty words, but it wouldn't have meant very much. Instead, the hugs and encouragement that she gave that scared, isolated little girl made her feel a little less alone. At the end of the school year, Ruby got her final report card. It was all A's. The principal said she didn't deserve them, that they were earned unfairly because Ruby got more help than all the regular kids. Unfair. Who do you think was really being unfair here? But thanks to the courage and determination of Ruby and others like her, things slowly started to get better. The following year, when Ruby came back for second grade, the angry crowds were gone. Marshals were not needed to bring her into the room, and the students had returned to William Frantz. And this time, some of them were black. Thanks to the courage and determination of Ruby and others like her, who stood up for what they believed in, every year, things got a little bit better. It was due to the courage and wisdom of that 6-year-old girl that I was able to finally understand that all people really are created equal, and that equal opportunity applies to everybody, black, white, all the shades in between. Now, you might say to yourself, well, that's obvious. But somehow it didn't seem so obvious at the time. Who knows? Maybe we'll always need the courage and wisdom of a brave child to remind us that all people are created equal,